Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Brendan Burns Show. Joining me today is Sarri Gilman, who has been a licensed marriage and family therapist since 1986, during which time she was also an executive director for several nonprofits and worked 7 years teaching leadership to managers and executives. She is an author, speaker, and community leader, fellow of the American Institute of Stress, and founder of the Transform Your Boundaries workshop and Naming and Taming Overwhelm workshop. Sarri has lived and worked on Whidbey Island, Washington in the Langley community since 1986. In 2012, she created the Transform Your Boundaries workshop. In 2014, Sarri completed the Transform Your Boundaries and brings this work to any community, workplace, conference, and private group to better lives, better work, and a better world through our relationship to our boundaries. She continues to write and teach on the subject, and in 2017, Sarri completed the book Naming and Taming Overwhelm for healthcare and human service providers. She continues to work in private practice, speak at events, and teach workshops. Sarri, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Awesome. So I came across your work due to my own personal transformation with setting boundaries in professional settings, in relationship settings. How did transforming and setting boundaries become a part of your life from the beginning to a point where you're one of the experts on it and you've written on it and teach it?
It came from observing and really struggling with my own clients in how they were managing their boundaries in their lives. And everything I learned in school about how to help people with boundaries didn't seem to apply to the real world. Like once you took it out of graduate school and kind of test drove it out on the road with real people didn't speak the language of psychology. And so it felt very useless. And I had to come up with a different way of helping people understand boundaries. Now, the gift of where I live, which is a very small community, it's like 2 blocks long, is that I see people in the grocery store and out on the street and people that I've worked with. And so if something I'm doing is helpful, they tell me, hey, that thing we did really worked and it stuck. And so I get this feedback about things from 5 years ago, things from 10 years ago. And I got to see that the map that I built to teach people boundaries, I was just using it over and over again with different people, and it was very reliably helping people. I, of course, had a long journey with boundary work myself personally. I was kind of born into this issue, and it's been lifelong work, and now I've come to understand that it's really lifelong work for all of us.
Yeah.
And this is really essential for people to understand because you're going to be using your boundaries throughout your lifetime, and it affects how we deal with all of our relationships. It affects how we deal with our work. It affects how we deal with our purpose in life. So it's a pretty big topic. And I realized that in all my work, in nonprofits, I was working on the issue of homelessness for a long time and with homeless teens. I started a shelter for homeless teens and learned a lot from them about a community that, could we expand our boundaries and take care of these kids? And then as I went into leadership work, it was the same kind of question. I saw leaders and managers really grappling with, where are the boundaries on my work? Where's the boundaries, that work-life balance? Where's the boundaries in what do I tolerate? What do I not tolerate? How do I raise people up? And so I realized this is just coming up everywhere. And I decided that was kind of the central theme. So I just really unpacked what was that map in my head and started teaching that, and realized that there was a real need for people to, and particularly counselors and coaches, to learn some reliable way to teach people boundary skills.
That's powerful. Now, are you outspoken about, I don't want to cross your boundaries, but have you shared in your public experience, like your own personal struggles with boundaries that prompted this? Because I resonate a lot with that, kind of being born into a cycle of people who didn't set boundaries like my parents not setting boundaries in their life and then breaking my boundaries. And I have shared a lot about kind of what prompted me to look into this work. I'm curious if you divulge that in terms of like where it came from and what your experiences were like in your life.
Yes, I do. And I did in a TEDx talk share a little bit about some of my own journey. But really, I was born into a family that struggled deeply with boundaries. And every place where you would think no's should be in my family growing up, there were yeses. And every place where you would think there would be a yes, there were no's. And so I realized my family had a very upside down view of where yeses and no's went. And I had to really figure out for myself, where were mine going to be? Both my parents were addicted to drugs. Both of them were heroin addicts. Both of them were in and out of jails. So, they really struggled with things like rules and boundaries. And and so I really, didn't get a map from them. I had to kind of come up with what is going to work here. And thank goodness I was raised by my grandparents in this community on Long Island where I got to see other families and their boundaries, and I got to see how that worked. And so that gave me a little bit of ground to stand on as a small child. And then growing up, I felt like I really had to take seriously what my choices were because there wasn't really good guidance around me.
Right. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I often work with people, or if I'm even just sharing this with my friends because I'm excited, I'm learning how to set boundaries now because it really is changing my life dramatically. And people, I find sometimes are in denial about their inability to set boundaries, and they chalk it up to just being nice. And I'm curious if you, how you work with someone, or how can we help open up people's eyes to, like, what's the difference between being nice and fair, and then where does it become I'm saying I'm being nice, but I'm really like not taking care of myself and really hurting myself potentially.
Well said. It's about the consequences, just like you just said. You start to feel consequences in your life when you are being so nice and you're really avoiding saying what you need to say, and you avoid speaking your truth. And the other thing that happens when you do that is, while you think you're being really nice to other people, you start getting this pile up of consequences in your own life where you don't have time for the things you love to do. I personally get pain in my body when I'm doing things the wrong way in my life, and I'll get it in my neck. So I can't turn my head. Some people get stomach pain. Some people get migraines. So sometimes you get it physically, these consequences, and they add up on you. And sometimes you become depressed or anxious because you really haven't been addressing what you need. And the other interesting consequence that happens, aside from all the symptoms that you get, is you get this split with your soul. Because your soul inside of you is here trying to have you have an experience in your life about what you need and what's going to help you grow and how to thrive. And you're ignoring your own soul. And you're just really, thinking about what others need and what others want from you. And that's important in relationship. But you also have an obligation to yourself and a relationship to your soul that if you don't address, that is a large part of where people find themselves depressed and anxious. I'm not saying all depression comes from there, but I'm saying a good part of it does. I always check for that when I work with somebody. When they come in and they're like, I'm depressed, I'm like, okay, well, let's figure out how you're doing with your boundaries in your life and with your listening to your own yes and no. And when they're not, and they're so busy being nice, their soul gets depressed watching this. Because the soul is like, what do you need me for? I mean, what are we even here for? You're not having a life of your own. So what do you want from me? And the soul becomes depressed. And it's like,
Wow.
I can't talk to this person. They're not even listening.
What an amazing analogy with the soul. So let's go to different types of boundaries where, and my question is, what are the harder or hardest boundaries that you find people have the most challenge trying to set? Where does that show up? And what strategies or advice do you have for people in those situations to get a little bit better?
Well, everybody struggles with the same kind of boundaries. Okay. There's regular, ordinary boundary stuff. And, I call them everyday basic boundaries that, many people are just learning from the very beginning, right? You and I were talking about that before we turned on the show, which is that some people come to this work and have, not any experience setting or using their boundaries. And so they're doing very basic boundary work to start that process. But all of us are going to run into what I call extreme boundary challenges. And we see extreme boundary challenges when we've had trauma, when we've had a lot of stress, when we're dealing with situations that are over our heads, like we don't know what to do in the situation. It's overwhelming to us. Oftentimes, we're trying to take care of somebody and we can't really help them or fix them or make things better. And we become overwhelmed in the process. So addiction, when people are working with addicts in their life and people who struggle with addiction, it's interesting. People who have addiction issues really struggle with boundaries. And then
does the lack of setting boundaries then create the addiction, or does the addiction create the boundaries?
So people who struggle with addiction issues are already struggling with boundary issues, right? With themselves. Yeah. And they have a health issue, which is addiction. But then they're in some kind of relationship to other people.
Right.
And in that relationship, you can be in a relationship to somebody who is struggling with addiction, and you're just wanting them to respect the boundaries that the two of you agreed to. And they're like, what boundaries, man? They keep getting violated. And you keep showing up going, all I want them to do is da, 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 da. And, I just told them no alcohol in the house. If you're going to drink, don't bring it into the house. And then I find all these bottles in the garage and they're shocked because people with addictions are extreme boundary challenges. People who have ADD can't really see boundaries. So, these are invisible things, and people with ADD tend to stumble over people's boundaries by accident a lot. So there are extreme boundary challenges. You end up in situations usually where you're trying to take care of something, do something good, help somebody, fix something, but it becomes overwhelming. And then you're kind of in this boundary backlog where how are you going to start setting boundaries now? And there's a couple of, they're kind of life preserver boundary tools, I think of them as. And they're all about, in these situations, they're about really defining your responsibilities. So when you're in an extreme boundary challenge, you cannot let other people define your responsibilities. You have to get in front of the train and you have to define, this is what I can offer. It begins here, it ends here. And until you define your responsibility, you're going to get heaped on with responsibilities. That's the nature of what I would call extreme boundary challenges, is when you're dealing with trauma, when you're dealing with a health issue. Let's take a health issue. I just broke my hip. Let's talk about health issues. So you go into our healthcare system these days, and have you ever noticed this? They want you to make all the decisions. Nowadays, healthcare is, which treatment option would you like? We could do surgery, we could do chemo, we could do XYZ, and suddenly you're the doctor. You have no information about this stuff. And you have to choose and make decisions and figure out what's best for you. And our healthcare system, then, your insurance may not agree with that and may not approve this. And so you end up kind of fighting for what you need for where the boundaries are, what your care is going to look like. And so that can be extremely challenging, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're dealing with these kinds of things, we have to look at what are our financial responsibilities? What can and can't we afford?
Yeah.
What's this going to cost us? Because every extreme challenge can be expensive. The next is, what are we going to be responsible for and what we can't be responsible for? What's really out of our hands? So that we know where the boundaries are, because you go into these systems and it feels like your boundaries don't count. Your boundaries don't matter. So it's a lot about definition.
Yeah.
And a lot about taking the reins in your hands in situations that feel really challenging. Does that help?
That helps a lot.
Specific?
Yeah,
it's all about responsibility.
That's perfect. As you were talking, the follow-up question that I'm curious about is the people. There can be people in our lives who are going to test our boundaries more than others.
The boundary challengers.
Yes, that's probably a nice way to call some of them. And
that's what I call them.
Yeah, boundary challengers. So I have a friend, he's a boundary challenger, and we were out for drinks, and we had all, I mean, this was years ago because I don't really drink much these days, but we were all drinking, and he really wanted us to all have another round with him. And he was challenging our boundaries around that, and he was going in the circle, and one guy was like, no, and he's like, oh, come on, yes. The other guy, no, come on, yes. And then he got to this third guy who was an ex-military guy who was just like, his spine was like a straight up line, and he's just like, no. And the guy goes, come on. He goes, negative. Come on. Not going to happen. Come on. And he just said no. And then finally the boundary challenger just gave up because he knew he was going to get a no. And I was really curious watching that, like, how can I be like that military guy? Right. So,
beautiful.
Because obviously it's not just this guy's fault, because this guy didn't want it and he made that happen. So I may have already kind of started to answer the question, but my question was, when you're working with people who have a hard time setting boundaries, do you ever advise them to change or modify or tweak who they spend time with to spend less time with people who may not respect their boundaries as well? Or is that actually a cop-out and you want to be around the challengers because it's more opportunity for growth? Or is it kind of a balance?
Well, that's interesting. So I definitely would never tell somebody who to spend time with based on their boundary issues. I really like people to become what I think of as boundary experts. And that military guy was a boundary expert.
Yeah.
So you could throw boundary challenges at him all day long, and that straight up spine will serve him well. I don't know how it serves him in his family, quite honestly, because in those relationships, they might want a little more give and take.
Right.
But, so what looks to you like, wow, that's how to do it in the world. That's true. That is how to do it in the world. I go out into the world, every interaction with human beings, your boundary alert should be on. If you're going to interact with human beings, just turn your boundary alerts on. That's how I do it. I go out into the world. It's like, oh, human beings in the grocery store. That means any moment somebody can come up and kind of challenge your boundaries.
Yeah.
Or push on them. And so just stay aware of what are my boundaries here? What do I choose as my boundaries there? It doesn't mean that I have to get the whole world to do it my way. It just means that I have to be aware of where my boundaries are, and that I'm around human beings, and human beings are going to push your boundaries even when they love you. So I don't tell people to stay away from all those challengers out there, because they could be married to one.
Right.
So, this is a life skill. This is about, if you're going to take this skill in life, which is to avoid all the boundary challengers out there because they annoy you, they exhaust you, they deplete you,
Right.
and you just don't want to be around them. Well, you're going to have a hard time avoiding them all, because they're everywhere. So, it's better to know how do you put in and have the energy to interact with them, and how do you hold your limits, and when do you decide that a relationship doesn't feed you in any way, and it has not no purpose in your life? And when do you pull back and say, this is not a good purpose for me? And that's okay too, but not because it's just too hard to set a boundary,
Right.
and you can have really interesting conversations with those people
Mm.
about like, hey, which part of no didn't you just grasp? Like, where did you learn? I'm so interested because like, where did this person who is pushing all the boundaries, where did they learn that they just need to convince people and then they get a yes? Like if they just ask 10 times, is 15 the magic number? Like what is the magic number for them? They to them, it's like a, I can picture them like almost in a casino going, at a certain point I get my yes. And that is probably what they grew up with. At a certain point, I get yes. I just have to bug you enough. So it's really nice to say to these people, you don't even need to ask me twice. My mind doesn't shift that quickly.
Right.
Like once I have a no, it's a really good no. It's solid.
What if you've practiced this ability to set boundaries and you've spoken up to someone and you've said, look, this violates my boundaries, and they say to you, I hear you, I respect that, and I won't do it again, and then they do it again.
Mm-hmm. And then it's on you to say, so that's a line for me. It either violates my beliefs or what I stand for or what I'm comfortable with. And I get that you can't manage the line, so I'm managing the line.
Mm-hmm.
But if you set it up so that I can't manage it, then we've got a problem in our relationship. So let's pretend it's like a credit card issue. So you have a partner, you've agreed not to spend on the credit card. You open up the credit card statement and bam, this person has charged up another $5,000. And you're like, what? We agreed not to. This happens in relationship all the time. We agreed not to. What happened to that agreement?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that do to trust between us? So this boundary stuff, really becomes the essence of, can I trust you in relationship? How close can I be? Can I share money with you? Can I share housing with you? Can I share a life with you? How much can we really trust each other to live within the boundaries that we agree to? So if you're not really agreeing to it and you're just saying yes to me and then you're doing whatever you want, how do I know what we've agreed to?
Yeah.
Like that's confusing for me.
Yeah.
So do we need to change our credit card thing, or are you going to show up in this relationship upholding agreements? Because I don't want to do it otherwise.
Yeah.
Because that just brings us down to trust.
Yeah. That's fair.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. No, absolutely. So and the way you said it was very grounded, firm, but also like kind and non-threatening, which sounds like a good balance there.
Mm-hmm.
At least that was my perception of it. And
and I also, in these situations, I also ask people, before you get into a very close business relationship or intimate relationship, like test the boundaries.
Right.
Like get to know, like, is this somebody that's capable of upholding agreements with me? Or am I just assuming, well, we're going to uphold all of our agreements? Like I need to test the boundaries with people and be sure I understand their boundaries, be sure they understand mine, even in a business relationship, like, to know that like people are going to uphold those. That's really crucial in a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and just to kind of complete the circle, and like it sounds like that kind of conversation will often work and the other partner will hear it. But if in just a worst case scenario, the person speaks up that additional time like you demonstrated, and then the person says yes again, but then also continues to use the credit card like that, do you then advise the person who's setting the boundary, say you set them properly and the person's just not capable, and move on?
Yeah, so then I say, what do you want to do about that? Like, what do you want to do with that violation? What's that violation doing to your soul on the inside?
Yeah.
Because sometimes I see people stay in these relationships where they're getting these boundary violations. It's up to them. I don't say to them, hey, the only way out now is to leave. I still like to put it on the table and say, let's look that square in the face. What does that mean to you?
Mm.
How are you putting the pieces together inside your head now? And how are you going to protect yourself in the relationship? Because if you're going to stay very intimate with this person that is running up credit card bills with your name on it, or you're married and you're going to be stuck with bills like this, what does that mean for you? What does that stress go inside of you? How are you going to manage that? What do you feel like your choices are?
Yeah.
And that's where the boundary work really begins. It's really sitting down up against rocks like that in our lives where we figure out, what are my choices? Do I have to be victim to somebody else's decision? Or can I say, okay, well, you really need to have kind of credit cards like that. We're married. I'm not going to stay married. I'm not going to incur this kind of debt. So, you're willing to put the marriage on the line for that. That's okay. That's up to you.
Mm.
So, having the credit cards and overspending is a place I'm not going to go to. I'm not going to live my life in debt like that.
Right.
And I've decided I have a choice.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that that's what people choose. Sometimes people will stay, and I'll just say, how do you protect yourself?
Yeah.
Because I'm really curious about that.
Yeah.
Because then 8 years later, the other person walks out on the relationship, and now they're left with $40,000 of credit card debt that they never even incurred, but they did because they were with a partner that was doing that. And now half the bill is theirs. And it's like, okay, if you want that to be your life story, see, now we're getting into something that you'll see a lot with people, is this feeling of being a victim of somebody else's boundary decisions.
Yeah, you let someone stomp on your boundaries and then you blame them when you really do have a choice.
Well, what happens is, I think people try to make sacrifices and they end up sacrificing themselves.
Well, I was going to ask you that for my questions.
Go ahead. What's the question
No,
on
I
that?
mean, you're already answering it, which is, what's the balance between, because when I told you about that military guy, you were like, well, hopefully he's not overly saying no, like, where's the balance where there's a compromise versus, all right, you're giving too much? Like, how do you help people find that line?
That is really easy to find, which is ask other people about their boundaries. Get to know in relationships, what do you need? Where can I compromise? Where can we agree to a boundary together that is going to work for all of us? Yeah. So, for example, sometimes I hire people to do some part-time work for me, right? And so I had an assistant, and on hiring, I say, what do you need from me in terms of advance notice for a project? How much lead time are you going to need to get it done? I ask that at a print shop. Before I do a print job, I say, how much notice do you need? I say the same thing with hiring an assistant. And what can I expect from you in terms of turnaround and availability? And what happens if you can't get to my job? How will you communicate that to me? What happens when you need to say no? Are you able to say no to me? Or are you just going to say yes and be up at 2 or 3 in the morning and like push it? And then I'm going to get a bunch of errors back in the work and then I have to correct it. Like, how do I know that like you're taking care of you? Where's your boundaries? What do you need from me? And can I agree to that? So this person that I hired then said, I'm going to be working your jobs Thursdays and Fridays. So as long as you get things to me by Tuesday, I can line it up. And if something happens in my life, like a crisis or something's going on, I will give you notice that, I'm going to be out for this much and I've hired an assistant that will take on a job. And if you don't like the job, don't pay for it. Like we come up with a whole bunch of, but I come to relationships first, not about here's my boundaries, but I want to know your boundaries. And I want to know that you know where they are. And I don't want to work with people that don't know where they are. Because like that's already a setup for me. Then I'm the only one in the relationship with boundaries. That sucks. That sucks because
Yeah.
now we aren't on equal footing about anything. All the boundaries are coming from me, and I don't want a relationship like that. I want to interact and work with people that also have a sense of their own, and I want to know what those are.
I mean, obviously asking like you demonstrated is a great way to do that. Is there anything else you can do either emotionally or through tone or anything to help promote and make someone feel safe enough to really honestly share what their boundaries are?
It's by always giving them permission and saying it is okay to say no to me. It's okay if this is a no for you. Just tell me. I just need to know that. So I just had this happen. I was working with somebody, a contractor that was building something for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a certain budget, like, don't go beyond this budget. And I said, and I'm like kind of strict about managing money on a project. And I said, so we'll have a weekly check-in just on the budget, takes 10 minutes. I just want to know that we're in line.
Yep.
Well, the person came to the meeting and weekly and didn't tell me that they were running over at all. And I was like, this line item, this line item, this line, yep, everything's okay. Well, then I got a bill and it was $25,000 more than expected. And I was like, whoa, what just happened?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I didn't know how to tell you that it was running over. Look how shocked you are. You're looking like I
I'm
look.
like, what? What do you mean you didn't know how to tell me?
Right. That was the whole point of this exchange.
Yeah.
And so I said, I'm so sorry. I have to take you off the job.
Yeah.
And I loved working with you. Like I thought we were communicating. And I was like, but you weren't telling me. I said, I feel really bad about doing this, but I have to let you go because I can't afford to make decisions that way for me because I pay for those.
Yeah.
But I wasn't angry at him. It was a beautiful departure.
Yep.
And he understood. He wasn't angry. He said, I blew it. And I said, yeah. I said, I hope on your next thing, maybe this can be a gift for you. Maybe you can use it, but I have to hire somebody that can communicate about the money more directly. So I thought we were on the same track, and that happens.
Yeah.
But it still doesn't turn ugly and angry when my boundary got violated. It wasn't like, oh, I'm a big victim of you. It was like, wow, caught it, but we have a problem now, and I'm not going to go forward with you because that's not okay for me. Now I'm responsible for the boundary and managing the whole thing. I'm not going to now leave that in your hands. So
yeah, that's a great story. I want to ask about, a lot of people are afraid to set boundaries, at least from what I've noticed, like in like business settings. Like, they want to keep the business, they want to keep the client, so they charge less, they make themselves too available. And in the past year, I've like 4x'd my rates. I'm 1/4 as available. I have a team, and I command so much more respect. I've attracted such a higher demographic of people. I have my life back. I have so much free time. I don't work Fridays usually.
You have become a boundaries expert.
I'm becoming a boundaries expert.
Yeah, that's how you do it.
And I'll tell you, like,
it took time though, didn't it, Brandon?
It took work and therapy and all this stuff. Yeah.
Time, right?
Yeah, time.
And it also took practice and time. Like, it didn't happen overnight, right?
Oh, no way. I used to walk around my room and like envision, I would say no and envision like my boss there. I did all these different exercises. It took time.
And practice. See, I say to people, it could, like, if you dive into this boundary work, if you're listening to me and Brandon right now and you're like, oh my God, I need this in my life, expect to become a boundaries expert, which is what Brandon just described, his own becoming an expert in his life on his boundaries. It takes about 2 years.
Yeah.
From like, I'm going to get to the boundary work and start digging in and looking at this in my life, to practicing, to getting it wrong, to then getting it right, to making big changes. You will then feel that expertise in 2 years if you start now taking this on.
Yeah, exactly. And so to build on that, why is it that now when people ask me when I'm available and I say, oh no, I can't talk for 2 weeks, or this is my hire, like, why is, like, I feel like people are afraid to disappoint and they lose it. But when you set those boundaries, why do people actually respect you and like you more and value you higher when you say no more?
I think part of it is that you're modeling self-care and well-being.
Yeah.
And that's who people want to work with.
Yeah.
They don't want to work with people that are running around with their heads cut off, exhausted and afraid, and, oh, I'll get to that, and I'm sorry I dropped the call, and I forgot we had a thing, and I'll get to it next week. And, you know, you get less and less functional the more you try to balance all the things on top of your head that you really can't manage. And when you're sleep deprived, you start making really poor decisions. And so, and if you're resentful, it kind of comes out in your tone to people, right? So they get it and they feel repelled. When you are very firm, and I have the same thing, I am really firm about, you know, my practice, my private practice, and my hours and my access and availability, and you do good work with people, and you have a reputation. It's well earned, but that when you're working, you really show up for people. You're there.
Yeah.
You're present. Yeah. People want to work with somebody who's present. And I've had people that and it shocks me, they'll wait 6-8 months to see me in private practice. And I'll say to them, I can get you a therapist like tomorrow, somebody who's good, somebody who does great work can get you in next week. You don't need to wait 6 or 8 months for me. And they're like, nope, I'll wait. And they do. And I think some of that is when you see somebody who has the skills that you know you need and they are truly living them, you know that they're going to be able to lead you through it.
That's right on, because back then when I wasn't setting the boundaries, maybe I was making money, but I was constantly stressed out and they could feel that. And now when I'm like, no, I charge more and you have less access to me, but I'm making more money and I'm working less, people are like, oh, I want to work with you so you can teach me how to do that.
Because that's what they want.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so people come to me because they want to feel better.
Yeah.
So it won't help if I come into the room and I'm not feeling well. You know, this accident where I broke my hip and my femur has been an incredible gift to my clients who work with me, because those who work with me, like personally, have gotten to see, I always do fairly good self-care. So I feel like I'm a model of that. But with this hip injury, they've gotten to see it go up on a whole nother level. And, you know, I've had to say things like, I can't see clients in the morning. I have to do physical therapy. I need to take walks with my dog. I need to sit on heat. I need to take more care of myself. And so my day cannot begin until this hour.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we've had to juggle with that. But at the same time, my clients have also seen, wow, you get an injury, your self-care needs to go up, not down. Not just push it and hide it and try to just cover it up and keep going.
Yeah, some like societal messages sometimes can be like, just toughen up, push through it. Like a lot of athletes in professional sports in the US, like the NBA and the NFL, like ESPN will publish articles kind of like lionizing and glorifying these guys for like pushing through it and being tough guys. But then they're in wheelchairs the rest of their life with injuries that didn't properly heal.
Right. And so, you know, this really, you become an expert in boundaries, but you also become a model of self-care. And I think anybody that's coaching or counseling needs to be a model of self-care.
Yeah.
Because that's what helps you feel well.
So one of the last questions I had is based on something you mentioned earlier, which I thought was really interesting, which is you mentioned that some people who have ADD are not even aware of other people's boundaries. Do you ever work with those people in terms of helping them better see, or even just people who don't have that but may have a hard time? Like, how can people get better at understanding and seeing other people's boundaries?
So we work on how invisible boundaries are. Because if you have ADD, we have to talk about how we're dealing with something that's invisible. It's not your fault if you can't see it. It's not visible.
Right.
And so now we have to deal with, how do you recognize somebody's cues for a boundary?
Yeah.
And how can you ask about a boundary? And then how, if you stumble on somebody's boundary, how can you own that and take responsibility for, did you intend that? Was it unintentional? How can you correct it the next time? What can you do for taking responsibility? And where are some of your boundaries? Because not only is it hard to see other people's boundaries if you have ADD, it's also hard to see your own.
Yeah.
So how do you set up a little bit of a structure for yourself so that you know where your boundaries are and that you're within those?
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to look at impulsivity and look at, you know, impulsivity may mean that you suddenly make excuses for breaking boundaries. Like, oh, but in this case, it's fine for me to drink, even though I don't drink and drive, because I'm saying goodbye to this one friend that I'm not going to see for a long time. And, you know, it's like, that's what we're doing. And then you break your own rules.
Yeah.
So we have to look at that and make it very concrete for people with ADD, and then they can learn how to see them.
That's powerful. To kind of close it out, if someone's listening to this right now and they're blowing their minds, they're listening to you. Before, I want to also ask like where people can learn more about you and find more about your works and your book. But what would be like the first step in someone who's resonating a lot with this discussion we're having to begin a practice of like understanding their boundaries? Like, what's the sort of first step towards that goal of becoming a boundary expert?
So the very first step is evaluating your own self-care.
Yeah.
Is not look at your relationships. Just start with your own self-care. How are you doing on eating, sleeping, and exercise? Just the basics of self-care. And do you give yourself kind of good marks there, or are you already like, gosh, I really wanted to work out more. I wanted to get to the gym. I've been wanting to change my diet. So start there. And if you have those things under, gotten those under your belt and you're doing really well with those, then I want you to learn about the 7 patterns and figure out what pattern you use. And that is the only reason why I wrote the book, Transform Your Boundaries. And it goes over 7 patterns that people experience in their life. And you need to figure out what pattern you're using and then how do you bring balance. So an example of the 7 patterns are workaholic, numbers, isolating, sacrificing, lovers, people who love and never feel loved in return, protectors, and caregivers. So figure out which pattern that you use. Like for me, I was like kind of a lifelong workaholic caregiver. And that is where my recovery began. The book will take you through each of the patterns and help you understand them. And then it gives you journal questions to dig your way out. And so I think until you do the pattern work, you're going to feel kind of stuck. So I want you to go with self-care first and then patterns, understanding those. And then we get to dealing with extreme challenges, which is often why people want to work on boundaries, is they're drowning in extreme boundary challenges. I understand that, but we start with self-care. And start ways that you can increase your self-care. How's that for a beginning?
No, that resonates a lot with me. I found my background was went to law school, business school, like overachiever mentality, worked on Wall Street, all to become a workaholic, to numb, isolate. I definitely resonate with a handful of those 7 from my past. And that's an amazing place to start. You've given me a lot to think about. You've given our listeners a lot to think about. For those who are interested in more, and I bet the majority of listeners are, where can people find more about, where can they buy the book? Do you have a website, et cetera?
So I have a website. It's sarrigilman.com, sarrigilman.com. The book is Transform Your Boundaries. It's on Amazon. It's available in most bookstores. So if you're into independent bookstores, they can also order it there. It's also available on Kindle. And I also have some online classes. I have an online school. So if you go into my website around webinars and classes, you can also get on to some of the online classes on boundaries, and those are recordings. And then a couple times a year I teach live. So I teach a 3-day boundary immersion once a year at a retreat center, and people can attend that, and it's going to be March 6 to 8 in 2020. And I also teach live a class for coaches and counselors online, so that's available to them. And then most of my other workshops are privately scheduled. I'll go places and have a group where somebody wants me to teach there. So that's available by kind of private scheduling.
Awesome. Well, Sarri, thank you so much for being generous with your time today, with sharing some amazing wisdom and knowledge. And for all those listeners out there, we're going to be going from starting with this to becoming boundary experts. So Sarri Gilman, thank you again for coming on the show.
Anybody can do it. And Brandon, I'm so excited that you're a model of this and that you really understand the value and the importance of this, because I think that's going to be inspiring to your listeners, because you've already done the journey, you've done the work, there's another side.
Oh,
right?
yeah. And it's
life with boundaries is better, right?
They need a t-shirt. You should make one. Life with boundaries is better, and have your website on the back.
Okay, we're going to go for that. All right. Life with boundaries is better.
Amen.
All right. Oh, have a great weekend.
Thank you too. Take care, Sarri.